There is a pretty dramatic increase in the divorce rate. About 1 in 2 couples are seeing their marriages end in divorce.
Hello and welcome. I'm Olivia Brown with the Western Journal. Today we have a very special guest, Brad Wilcox from the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia. Welcome, Brad.
It's good to be here, Olivia.
You have really studied the rise of divorce in America. Can you tell me how divorce escalated after the no-fault divorce laws?
Yeah, so Olivia, what we see basically in the research is that there is a pretty dramatic increase in the divorce rate from the late 60s through the early 1980s, where about 20% of couples are seeing their marriages end in divorce, in the late 60s to about 1 in 2 couples are seeing their marriages end in divorce in around 1980. So the sort of 1970s is kind of like the apex of the divorce revolution that kind of courses through the American society at that point in time.
Divorce revolution go hand in hand with the sexual revolution that we saw in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, I think that's certainly part of the story is that sort of as mores shifted around sex and marriage, I mean, the 70s were known as kind of like the swinging 70s, for instance. People's commitment to, sticking with their spouse and, honoring, the sort of the marriage vow in any number of ways, certainly diminished. So that's part and parcel of why divorce skyrocketed. I think also that we can think about the 70s as kind of like the me decade, what Tom Wolfe again called the me decade. And people began to see marriage in terms of like what makes me happy, what makes me fulfilled, much less likely to think about marriage in terms of, duty and obligation, being a good spouse, being a good mother, a good father. And so that kind of me first mentality also proved corrosive when it came to marital stability as well. The problem with kind of that more soulmate view or that more romantic view of marriage is it puts too much, I think, emphasis on just kind of feelings and on what makes me as an individual happy. And, no person, no relationship is capable of kind of making us happy all the time or even most of the time. And if we think about ourselves as our primary concern, the paradox here is that we end up actually being, not just more likely to get divorced, but also less happy. Whereas if we kind of think about marriage as an opportunity to serve our spouse, to serve any kids that we have, also to kind of be of service to our kin, what we see in the data is that people actually end up being not just more stably married, but also more happily married as well. So the kind of turn towards a more soulmatey, a more kind of me first, a more individualistic model of marriage, that unfolded in the 70s and beyond for a lot of Americans, was a recipe both for not just divorce, but also often for being more likely to be miserable at some point in your marriage as well.
Can you go a little bit more into detail about poverty and marriage and education and marriage?
Yeah, so if you looked at kind of marriage trends in the 50s, the 60s, the early 70s, there weren't kind of really big divides in American life in terms of class or race or ethnicity. African Americans, Hispanic Americans, poor Americans, middle class Americans, rich Americans, they all kind of tended to get married and stay married up through the late 60s and 70s when things began to shift. And since then, we've seen kind of the emergence of a big class divide in American life, a big racial divide as well, where working class and poor Americans, African Americans are both less likely today to get married in the first place and more likely to land in divorce court in the second place, if they do marry. So what we saw in some research that I did, for instance, is that basically Americans who didn't have a college degree were about 60% more likely to get divorced than their peers who had a college degree. Another way to think about this is that today, Americans who are college educated, a clear majority of them are, as adults, are stably married. And that's not true for the majority of adults who don't have that college degree. So there is, again, a clear connection between education, income, and your odds of getting married today and staying married as well.
That's very interesting. I recently had a conversation with my friend asking me, why don't you just move in with your boyfriend? And I said, no, I want to wait until we are married to do that. Can you talk a little bit more about the rise of cohabitation and why it is so prevalent in people my age? I'm a millennial.
So, back in, again, the 50s and 60s, the vast majority of young adults would not cohabit prior to marriage. Cohabitation, takes or sees a big increase in the 70s and beyond. So we're now at the point where about 75% of folks who are getting married are cohabiting prior to marriage. So most of your peers are cohabiting, and doing so before they marry, if they marry. But we also see, I think, and this is surprising to a lot of people, that cohabitation is linked to reports of less marital happiness and also to a greater risk of divorce. And so a study done by the Stanford sociologist Michael Rosenfeld, for instance, found that folks who were cohabiting prior to marriage were about 30% more likely to end up getting divorced. And I did some recent research with Lyman Stone, a demographer, and we found that today, for looking at a large sample of American women, that women who were getting married in their 20s without cohabiting prior to marriage were the least likely actually to be avoiding divorce court, and that their peers who were cohabiting were more likely to end up getting divorced than they were if they weren't sort of living with a partner prior to marriage. So again, sort of the bottom line here is that, and this comes as a surprise to the vast majority of my students here at UVA, is that cohabiting prior to marriage, particularly cohabiting with more than one partner prior to marriage, is definitely a risk factor when it comes to your ability to form a strong and stable marriage.
We've been seeing now that it's been incredibly detrimental to children that grew up around divorce. Can you speak to people that say, I think that it's better to have a child not in a hostile home instead of getting divorced, staying with a child?
Yeah, so it's important to kind of recognize that it is the case that if there's physical violence in your marriage, if there's like regular screaming fits, in your marriage, in these kind of high conflict situations, it's often best for parents to part way. The problem, though, is that most divorces involving children today do not involve these kinds of high conflict situations. It's a situation where, one spouse has drifted apart, from the other spouse. One spouse is maybe depressed for a period of time, or one spouse has had kind of like a one-off affair. And these sort of lower conflict, situations, if your priority is kind of making sure that your kids are going to turn out okay, then you should stay together, is what the research tells us, because kids whose parents are stably married are much more likely to graduate from college. They're much less likely to end up being suspended by their high school principal. They're much less likely to end up incarcerated if they're young men, or depressed if they're young women. And so there's just a very strong association between social, educational, and emotional flourishing for our kids and our young adults today, and the stability of their parents' marriages. And again, sort of the unfortunate reality is that we see plenty of divorces today involving situations where one spouse is unhappy at that moment in time in the marriage, and the other spouse hasn't done anything major. It's not been abusive. It's not like a drug addict. It's not a serial philanderer. But the other spouse just kind of feels like she wants a new start, for instance, or he has noticed someone at work who catches his eye and wants, again, a new start. And it's precisely in those kinds of lower conflict divorces where, kids end up paying the biggest price for seeing their parents break up or get divorced.
How does that impact how Gen Z and millennials view marriage instead of boomers and Gen X?
I think there is an aspiration on the part of younger adults today to if you are going to get married, to really do everything you can to make it work. And we are seeing the divorce rate in the United States coming down since 1980. Although I think my concern there is that it may be more a question of postponing divorce rather than foregoing divorce. So even though there's kind of like this intention that you want to do things differently than your parents or your grandparents did, if they were caught up in the divorce revolution of the late 60s and 70s, people can kind of get caught up in patterns of behavior that make them more vulnerable to divorce. So it's probably worth mentioning here that there are, a couple of things that kind of protect you from getting divorced. And those things would be, for instance, attending religious services together as a couple would be one thing that protects you from divorce. Getting that college degree is linked to lower divorce. Having the husband be stably employed full time is also, a big factor that protects you from getting divorce. Having both spouses look at marriage as a kind of a permanent commitment is also, a major protective factor as well. So there are kind of a couple of economic or financial things you can do, a couple of sort of attitudes that you can kind of, take on, and then plugging into a community of people who share a commitment to marriage, like a religious community. These are all things that will reduce your risk of ending up in divorce court.
Is there any legislation that can help strengthen marriage and prevent divorce?
So I think one thing we should be thinking about right now at the federal level is eliminating marriage penalties that attend to a lot of our means-tested programs, our welfare programs like Medicaid and the earned income tax credit. So what a lot of working class couples find out is that when they have kids, it makes more financial sense for them not to get married, but just to cohabit and have the mom basically apply for benefits from the government. So we need to address the marriage penalties that are embedded in a lot of our public policy programs serving working class and poor Americans. So that's one thing we could think about. I think kind of longer term, we could think about efforts to sort of reform divorce laws. We're not going to go back to the fault-based model that Ronald Reagan was, confronting when he was, living back in the 1940s, for instance, when his first marriage came apart. But we could, I think, begin to think about measures to sort of take into account when it comes to things like property division and child custody, who initiated the divorce, and to kind of basically give the spouse who wants to remain with the marriage to honor that contract or that covenant, depending upon how you look at marriage, with primary custody of the kids and a greater division of the community property coming out of the marriage. Unless you can show some, major, bad behavior on the part of that person. That would be, things like, a pattern of infidelity, a pattern of abuse, a pattern of abandonment, either practically or financially, or, substance abuse. But to kind of basically do more to kind of honor the marriage contract, the marriage covenant, from a legal perspective, so the people who are kind of investing their lives in a marriage will, recoup some of those benefits, if the other spouse decides for, no real great reason to leave the marriage.
Do you feel hopeful for the future of marriage in America?
That's a great question. I don't necessarily feel hopeful for marriage as a kind of an institution for everybody. We have seen, as I mentioned before, a pretty marked decline in marriage since 1970. And so we have about half of Americans who are married currently, and the marriage rate again is coming down. But what I think does give me hope is two things. One is the research continues to be very strong about kind of the benefits of marriage for men, women, children, and communities. So I think for those with eyes to sort of see that research and to kind of internalize that research, that kind of gives them, I think, some hope and inspiration. And the second thing that's kind of a paradox, I would say, is that even as sort of marriage declines and community life often declines, sort of, I think the relative value of marriage for both adults and kids seems to be increasing. So what I mean concretely, for instance, is kind of like there is new research from the St. Louis Fed, for instance, showing that financially, the premium associated with being stably married has increased for adults in America. They're enjoying relatively more wealth than they did, compared to their single peers in the 70s, for instance. We're seeing also that kids who are being raised by stably married parents have an extra educational advantage today compared to, say, 25 years ago, on topics ranging or outcomes ranging from being suspended in school to graduating from college. So again, I think for people who are kind of smart enough or otherwise inclined to kind of sort of pay attention to this data and this research, they can see that marriage is this core institution, and that this institution may be even more consequential in a world that's more atomized, more economically unequal, and where more and more people are feeling kind of lonely and are spending too much time on their devices. So having kind of a spouse, having kids, I think gives you kind of an in-person community that is, and a financial sort of stability that's probably even more valuable today than it was 30 or 40 years ago.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope that you can come back in the future, and hopefully in 2023, 2024, we will continue to have the uptick of people staying together.
That'd be great, Olivia. Thanks for having me on today.